Sometimes I have in the past used the excuse of not printing my sermon to cover up that I'm rewriting it on the fly because the Spirit said to do so, and it sounds more rhetorically correct. This morning is not an excuse. I have a good sermon. I hear it now from my memory, but I forgot to print it. It's on my computer. It's not in paper yet. So, yeah. There'll be no turning of pages today because there's no pages to turn. So pray with me, please. Holy God, move in this space, move around us, help us to hear your voice, help us to know you near. Help us to hear your voice speaking to us. We might respond to you in your Spirit. We pray in your Son's name, amen. I didn't think a lot about Mary when I was growing up. I grew up very Protestant, okay? But does that say I never had thoughts about her? For one, I adored the song Ave Maria. Love that song. Back when I was in high school, I went to a singing festival and I bought Ave Maria, so I have a copy of it in my house. And then I realized there were at least 2 Ave Marias, and I had bought the wrong one. So I had to buy a different Ave Maria because I didn't want the one that wasn't the famous one. Now I have 2 of them. And of course, I grew up in a town that was very, very Catholic, much like Batesville. About half of the population of my town were members or attended the local Roman Catholic Church. And in my family, on my dad's side, about 75% is a quick math in my head, it might be higher than that, of my dad's side of the family are also Roman Catholic. So while Mary was not a every week conversation topic at Sunday school, we had moments which we talked about Mary. And one of them that I remember clearly happened in 6th grade. That was the year I had a nun for a teacher. Now, I have to understand 2 things for this story to fully be grasped. And one is, I went to public school from K through 12. There was no private school for my grade school and high school career. But also, the public school building nearest us was the one that was rented in the local Catholic church. And there was a teacher there who I'm not sure wasn't there when it was itself a private school. She just stayed. I'm not entirely certain of that history. But she was a nun. She was amazing and wonderful and was one of my favorite teachers. Her name was Sister Richard. The other thing to know about the story is that, again, sort of similar to Batesville, and certainly lots of small towns, especially of 30 years ago, the separation of church and state was only sort of followed. We didn't have prayer before football games or anything, or even basketball games. We didn't have football in high school. But also, our Christmas programs in grade school had religious themes, and my 6th grade teacher was a nun. So, one day in class, she started talking about Mary's Annunciation, how Mary learned that she was going to bear Jesus. Don't ask me how this topic came up as a normal public school 6th grade conversation. I have no idea how we got there. It's been a long time. I was 12, okay? But it did. I remember it. As Sister Richard told the story, Mary was approached by the angel Gabriel and asked if she would bear the Son of God, if she would bear Jesus. And Sister Richard said, all of creation waited and held its breath to see what Mary would say. Years later, I would do things like have intentional Bible study times and go to seminary, and I looked for this passage. It's not there. You can look all you want in the Gospels of Luke and John and Mark and Matthew, and there is no verse that says creation held its breath. It's not in the Bible. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that says it couldn't be what happened, but it's not there. As far as I can tell, my research comes from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the 15th century, who gave a sermon about the Annunciation, and This idea of creation holding its breath comes from him. But I love the idea. I love the image of creation waiting to hear Mary's answer. There are several reasons for that, and one is I love the givingness that Mary had to give consent. The Gospel of Luke is not clear on that, by the way. If you look in the Gospel of Luke, it is not clear what would happen if Mary wanted to say no. It is clear that she says, that she gives her affirmation. She says the words, "Let it be for me according to your word." But the Gospel of Luke doesn't say that she could have said no. What would have happened if Gabriel had said, "You're going to be God's son," and Mary said, no, thank you. It's not clear. So the image of all creation holding its breath is one I love, because it makes it clearer that Mary had to give consent. And in this instance, consent is pretty important. I don't tell many of you ladies that pregnancy is a big deal. It changes your body, it changes your hormones, it's 9 months of sometimes uncomfortableness, sometimes a lot of uncomfortableness, and I'm not going to go further than that because y'all know much more than me, and I don't want to dig a hole. Parenting, by the way, is also a big deal, a separate big deal. When done right, if you parent, you change your priorities. You have to think about other people before yourself now. You have to think about the foods that you choose to eat for dinner and make them nutritious and healthy, not just for yourself, because your kids need healthy food, and you have to make those choices. You have to buy car seats and install them and switch them around at the right times. You have to baby-proof the house. Parenting is a big deal. And neither of those things ought to be done without consent. As I said, the Gospel of Luke does not make it clear that Mary has to give consent, but we don't have to be so questionable. As I read the Gospel of Luke, I see Mary's words as her saying yes and her being allowed to say no. "Let it be for me according to your word," Mary said. And maybe, before she said it, all creation held its breath. The other thing about this image that I love so much is that it allows us to be like Mary. Because we too have times we get to say yes to God. Now, as I told the kids, thankfully, we don't have to say yes to God about bearing Jesus. That's been taken care of. It's covered. But we can follow Mary's example. Follow some of the circumstances in her example. Because Mary had fear. Mary had risks that she had to take. She had a risk of death. The law, the Torah says, in Mary's case, if Joseph were to denounce her and declare that the child she was bearing was not his child, she faced death by stoning. Well, I don't know enough about ancient Near East history to know whether or not that was a practice or simply a prescribed law that they ignored, but the law is clear. She should have been stoned to death for committing adultery. Even if she wasn't stoned to death, she still faced social isolation and embarrassment. She faced, if Joseph denounced her, the prospect of raising Jesus by herself. A single parent in a world where single parenthood was even harder than it would be now. Mary had risks, very real risks, in saying yes to God. And she said yes anyway. Mary said yes to God, not knowing what was going to happen in the future. She couldn't have known. She couldn't have imagined the trip to Bethlehem, the shepherds, and their stories about the angels. She couldn't have imagined, to borrow from another gospel, the Magi coming some years later and the flight to Egypt to be refugees for many years in fear of their lives, as their own government sought to kill them. She couldn't imagine watching her son grow and teaching and preaching and drawing crowds of 5,000 plus people in the wilderness. She couldn't imagine Holy Week and the cross and the empty tomb. She couldn't imagine all of this. Now, some maybe, after all, she gave the Magnificat just some verses later, so she maybe knew some things were coming. But all of it, beyond comprehension, beyond imagining. She didn't know what the future would bring, how God might use her. And yet she still said yes. Friends, we have the same invitation. We have the chance to say yes to God in a myriad number of ways throughout our lives. And while I doubt all of creation will hold its breath on our response, others might. The ones we can serve and care for, be they the poor, be they those who need food, like the ones we give to our food pantry, or homeless, who need us to serve in soup kitchens or give to inner city programs or advocate with our lawmakers for policies that will help homelessness. They are holding their breath, metaphorically, to see if we will say yes to God, do what we can to help them. Those who hold their breath might include those whom we can love. Those in the outskirts of society, those who are otherwise excluded, whom we can see and know as a part of our family, as a part of our community, and for whom we can make space here in our friendships, in other places of our lives, so that they will feel a part of it, included. And here I'm thinking of those who suffer from mental illness, those who suffer from racism or sexism, those who are immigrants, those who are foreigners, all of those in society sometimes says no to, we can say yes to God and show love to. They too are holding their breath. But here's the thing. Mary said yes to God and therefore changed the world. The very world that held its breath for her was changed by her yes, was changed by the coming of Jesus. And God's promises to us are this, that though our things are small and we're not going to have to bear Jesus, when we say yes to God, the world is still changed. The world is still made better. Because when we say yes to God, we're involving ourselves in God's ongoing mission and work in the world, the work of love and caring that God does. And the world becomes a better place because of what we've done, because of what God is doing, because we say yes. Friends, as Protestants, we don't think much about Mary all the time. At Christmas sometimes, but beyond that, not a lot. But I think perhaps our Catholic brothers and sisters have got something we can learn from. That's that Mary is one person worth emulating. Because in the face of risks, in the face of the unknown, in the face of all that could have made her say no, she said yes. Yes to Jesus. Yes to God. Let us do the same. Let us say yes to God in all the ways God invites us. And trust that somehow in that doing, the world is changed. Thanks be to God. Amen. And now we have a beautiful piece